to Kiama Library. Tonight we have author Deb Hunt with us, who will be talking about her adventures in Broken Hill. As someone who has been to Broken Hill and liked Broken Hill, I look forward to seeing some of those aspects, so let's make her welcome.
Thank you, Michael, and hello everybody. It's lovely to see so many of you here tonight. I'm going to be talking to you about love. Not the sort of romantic love of fairy tales, but the more gritty, rewarding love that I found in Broken Hill. I didn't find it immediately, I have to say. It took a while, but when I did find it, it was the most rewarding experience. And that is the topic of Love in the Outback. I think what I'll do is I'll start by reading to you from the prologue, which sets the scene of my experience in Broken Hill. And can everybody hear me? Because there is a microphone if anybody wants me to use a microphone. No? Great. "45 degrees. That's what they're forecasting for today. There's a total fire ban, and Maggie has left her kennel and retreated indoors. I'm freezing bottles of water so I can wrap them in towels and slip them into bed tonight. The curtains are drawn, the blinds are closed, and the evaporative air cooler is struggling to cope. It might bring the temperature down a few degrees, but only if I leave the doors and windows open so the air can circulate. That seems like madness on a day like today. Open windows are a sure invitation for blowflies, hateful creatures that settle in ugly clusters on furniture and countertops. At least we've still got power. A main transformer blew yesterday, and half the town was cut off for 5 hours. The sparkling waters of Sydney Harbour are 1,200 kilometres away from this remote outback town. It's a place of regular dust storms, plagues of mice and crickets, hordes of redback spiders, snakes, moths, locusts, cockroaches, and small black beetle things no one seems able to identify. It's also a place of sunsets that take your breath away, until the next morning, when you realise sunset was simply the prelude. Heritage-listed buildings of majestic beauty tower over crumbling miners' cottages. Modern bungalows stand next to ancient shacks, seemingly built entirely out of scrap metal. The road I live on dribbles to a stop when it reaches the edge of town, as if the original road gang simply lost interest, turned round and gave up, leaving the desert to reclaim its territory. Sharp sand nibbled at broken bitumen. Pavements are optional. It's an odd place for a middle-aged Englishwoman to live, a vegetarian with a lifetime of failed relationships behind her. But life has a strange way of sending you in the right direction when you finally stop fighting the tide. When I gave up on love and concentrated on like, this is where it led me. Saturday nights no longer involve tickets to Sydney Theatre Company or expensive restaurants in Balmain. We throw camping chairs into the car, pack an esky with steak and eggs, and drive out to an empty creek bed, where fallen branches from the coolabah tree form the basis of a roaring campfire. When the fire dies down, we settle a battered frying pan onto a bed of glowing charcoal and brew a billy for tea. Some nights there can be a dozen of us out there, surrounded by silence and empty space. The roof of our theatre, a million stars. The walls are lined with majestic trees. Love turned up too, much to my surprise. There was no spectacular electrical storm, no bolt of lightning or clap of thunder. Love simply stood beside me and waited, with infinite patience, for me to notice it was there. Having spent years chasing the wrong men, pursuing a romantic notion of love based on fairy tales and fiction, When the right man turned up, I was convinced he couldn't possibly be the man of my dreams. Well, he wasn't. And boy, am I lucky he wasn't. The man of my dreams would have made a rubbish partner. Sometimes it's hard to recognise the value of a real man until it's almost too late. I've found a level of contentment I didn't know existed, and I've never been happier. 5 years ago, it was a different story. So, 5 years previously, this is where I was living, in a small village in the West Country, in Gloucestershire in England, in a stone cottage built in 1840 with a beautiful garden. I grew all my own vegetables. It was idyllic, and I was miserable. The reasons why I was miserable are contained in the book, and I won't go into too much detail here because they are quite personal, but suffice to say that I was miserable because I was 49, I'd never been married, I had no children, the longest relationship I've ever had lasted less than 2 years, and I was doing a job I absolutely hated. I tried to resign from this particular job at 11 o'clock in the morning on the first day. I phoned my boss and I said, look, I'm so sorry, you've got the wrong person. I can't do this job. And she persuaded me to stay. Said, look, we'll find somebody else by the end of the week. And 4 years slipped past and I was still doing a job I hated as much as I did at 11 o'clock in the morning on the first day. So another thing to add in is that it was the depths of the winter. And here was the tipping point, the man I loved announced he was getting married, and not me. But before you start feeling sorry for me, I have to confess that we weren't actually going out with each other. He'd made it very clear he wasn't interested, but I was so desperate, so convinced that there was no life beyond 49, that I had fixed my attention on him and thought, no, I'm sorry, but you're my future. I am going to marry you. So, poor guy did eventually find somebody else, and the shock of it was enough to bring me to my senses and make me realise, what am I doing? I'm 49 and I'm doing a job I hate. Why? So I logged on to an Australian website. Now, I'd been in Australia before, I'd worked here, but I'd been back in England for about 4 years. And I found a job with the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And I'm not a nurse or a doctor or a pilot or an engineer, but they were looking for somebody for a junior position in the marketing department in Sydney. And it was the most junior position, being a communications coordinator. And I saw that job and something in me said, I want it. I want that job. I want to work for an organisation that does meaningful things. Maybe I will feel better about life if I can do a job that has some sense of purpose. So I had to look at what they were asking, and I had 3 hours in which to fill out this application form, because with the time difference between England and Australia, the closing date was approaching. So I literally poured everything into that application form. A few days later, I had an email, and they said, we'd like to interview you. Do you have Skype? So I instantly replied, yes, I've got Skype. I know modern communications. Of course, then I thought about the implication of what I'd said, and I realised that if they interviewed me on Skype, they would see I wasn't a junior. They would see I was 49. But by then it was too late. So, the next morning I had to switch my computer on at something like, I think I got up at 5 in the morning, midwinter, washed my hair, put some flowers near the computer, pushed it a long way away from me so you couldn't, you know, dimmed the lights, put a lamp next to me here, and logged on. And then I had a phone call saying, hello, this is the Royal Flying Doctor Service in Sydney. We can't get the technology to work. Can we do a phone interview instead? I said, yes, of course we can. And then tried to sound 30 years younger. Well, I think it must have worked because I got the job. And 3 weeks later, I was on my way to Australia, having rented out my house, sold my car, packed up my life, and got on a plane. Now, my first job when I arrived, because I arrived in 2008, which was the 80th anniversary of the founding of the RFTS, and my first job was to research some of the history of the organisation. All I really knew about it was what I'd seen from, anybody remember that old TV series, the 1970s? Well, I watched avidly in the UK, so I had a fairly dramatic picture of what the RFTS did. And I set to work researching what they really did. Now, if only I'd known, I actually arrived in Australia with the entire history of the RFTS in my back pocket, because on the $20 note, you've got the Reverend John Flynn, who was the man who campaigned for decades to get this service off the ground. There's the camel that he used to go out into the outback ministering on. There's the body chart they still use today on remote consultations in order to identify where the pain is specifically on your body. There's the front and the back, and it's all segmented so that the doctor who's carrying out the consultation can identify where the pain is. And just in the corner here, here's the pedal radio. So I found it fascinating researching the history of this organisation. And one of the things I came across was a newsletter that John Flynn himself wrote, and that's how he managed to galvanise support, is he wrote stories about what the RFTS did. And this is an extract from one of those stories, and it deals with a young lad who was only 10 years old. He had 4 younger brothers and sisters, and his father was away prospecting for gold. They lived in a remote part of, I believe it was South Australia. And while his father was away, his mother died. So there's a 10-year-old who's got 4 younger brothers and sisters, who's entirely on his own, no phone, no radio, no contact. And what he had to do was to walk barefoot with his younger siblings for 5 miles across desert in temperatures of 110 degrees in order to get help. And that's just one of the stories of what made people support the idea of setting up this service. But what I also discovered is that tyranny of distance still exists today for many people, in spite of the fact that we've got telecommunications, we've got computers, we have got the RFTS. This is Will and his mum, and Michelle lives at Durham Downs, which is a cattle station up near Cameron Corner, one of the most remotest places you can get to in Australia. She has to drive 1,200 kilometres in order to get to an orthodontist for one of her children. She's got 4 sons, and I think I did work out, because I tried to drive, I thought about driving there one time, and I think I worked out it would be 17 hours from Broken Hill, so I thought, no. And one day, Michelle was in the station kitchen, and Will, she thought, was at her feet. In fact, he'd crawled into the meat house, which is where they prepare meat. And the next thing she heard was a crash and a scream. And Will had climbed up onto an old-fashioned sausage-making machine, and which was standing on the floor, and his weight had toppled it over and had crushed his skull. So the flying doctor was called. They had to scramble a helicopter from one of the bases that the RFTS maintains in the Strzelecki Desert, in the oil and gas fields there. So the helicopter came from Baleara, I think it was, and at the same time they scrambled a plane from Broken Hill, and Will was taken down to hospital in Adelaide, and he made a full recovery. The stories always aren't as positive as that, but it really made me realise that Australia is a vast country, and most of us just cluster around the coastline, and you can understand why, because you've got access to all the services around the coastline. But in a remote area, it's just RFDS. Now, within a few weeks of arriving in Australia, I was asked to go to Broken Hill and Dubbo to go and take some photographs for the annual report, and to attend the Broken Hill Women's Auxiliary Ball. Now, this is a shot of Broken Hill, taken from on top of what locals affectionately refer to as the slag heap. It's not actually a slag heap, I've been told. It's a pile of tailings left over from decades of mining. There is now a fine dining restaurant on top of the slag heap, because locals are quite proud of this slag heap, and it's something, you can see it from wherever you are in Broken Hill. So this was my first impression of Broken Hill, and what I discovered when I started researching a little bit about Broken Hill was just what a rich history it's got. This is where BHP started. This is where many of the workers' rights that we take for granted in Australia now were hard fought for and won. And it's also where Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, was filmed, here in the Palace Hotel. Now, on that first trip, I met some of the staff who worked for the RTS. This is Shane Brooke, who's a pilot, Judy Whitehead, who is the nurse manager, and Karen Barlow, who's the senior flight nurse in Dubbo. I met some of the female GPs who work with the RTS, because a lot of small towns, country towns, they might, if they're lucky, have a GP, but the chances are that GP will be male. So if you want to see a GP, and you're a woman, you're forced to go to a male GP, and that's not always comfortable. So what the RTS does is they fly out an entire fleet of female GPs once every 6 weeks. They fly them out to all these different towns around Australia, and the female GP takes patients in the practice of the existing GP in that town. There were a couple of other people I met when I went to Dubbo, and one of these I'm sure you will recognise. Her Excellency now Dame Professor Marie Bashir, who until her official retirement in a couple of weeks' time is still the patron of the Royal Flying Doctor Service South Eastern Section. And what struck me about Her Excellency, I've heard her speak several times, and she always speaks from her heart. And she talks a lot about love. She talks about the love that Australians have for the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and the importance of that love. And I don't think I've ever heard somebody in such an elevated position talk from the heart in that way, and it really impressed me. The man that she's with is a man called Jack Stanmore, and Jack lives in Dubbo. He's been a lifelong supporter of the RFDS, and the reason why is that when he was born, he was terribly underweight. You wouldn't think so to look at him now. And very, very ill. And he only survived because he was airlifted. And the person who airlifted him was Nancy Bird Walton, who was herself a great supporter of the RFDS as well. And I had the huge privilege of interviewing her just a few months before she died. What an amazing woman. And she was in her 90s, I believe. She was in a nursing home in Sydney, and I went to interview her, and she had nail varnish that matched the colour of her lipstick, suit that was immaculate, her hair being done, and she had these high-heeled shoes on. I felt underdressed, I have to say. And there was one other person I met on that first trip to Broken Hill and Dubbo, and that was this man. Clyde, who I refer to in the book as Captain Considerate. Now, Clyde joined the Royal Flying Doctor Service 40 years ago as a pilot. And the man who persuaded him to join was the Reverend Fred Mackay, who was the spiritual successor to John Flynn. And the connection between Clyde and Fred Mackay is that although Clyde wasn't born in Australia, a very long story, I'll cut it short, he was born in Iran to Scottish parents who were working out there, and they, through a variety of circumstances, they lost everything and ended up emigrating to Australia because his father, with what little money they had left, had bought the pub in William Creek without knowing where William Creek was, without ever having seen it, and he took his family there. So Clyde and his sister and his mum and dad turned up at the pub in William Creek, and that's pretty much all there is in William Creek. It's a tiny town on the Oodnadatta track in South Australia, not far from Lake Eyre. And Clyde always tells the story of his mother, because they'd come from Iran where they were working in the oil industry, and they'd come from a very comfortable situation. And his mother arrived at the pub and looked around and said, well, where are the servants? And his father had to say, it's us. So, Fred Mackay was the minister who came through and who was instrumental in getting Clyde into boarding school in Adelaide. A few years later, when Clyde was 21, he was in a serious helicopter crash, which left him with third-degree burns to about 65% of his body. And he was in hospital for a year. When he came out of hospital, he decided he wanted to train to be a pilot himself. And Fred Mackay heard this, and when Clyde had qualified, he got in touch and said, we need you to work for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. Now, Clyde's plan had been to work for ANZET. And so he said to Reverend Fred Mackay, well, I'll do it for 2 years, okay? And then I want to go and be a commercial pilot. Well, thankfully he stayed for 40 years because, as we all know, ANZET went bust and the RFDS is still going. So and in that time, he rose from pilot to chief pilot to operations officer and finally to the CEO of the Southeastern section. So this is the man I met when I first went to Broken Hill. And I was struck by his energy, his dedication, his kind of fearsome commitment to work. But he didn't strike me in any other way. I stayed over the weekend, and there was a ball on the Saturday night which the Broken Hill Women's Auxiliary had organised. I saw Clyde at the ball, and he knew that I was in town on my own, so he said, do you have any plans for tomorrow, for Sunday? I said, no. He said, well, a group of us go cycling on a Sunday. Would you like to join us? So I thought, oh, that sounds nice. I had fond memories of cycling in the Cotswolds as a young person, stopping in tea shops. I thought, how lovely. So I said yes. Well, the next thing he said was, right, be at my house at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning then. Now, by that stage I couldn't back out because I'd said yes, so I agreed. And so I'm going to read you another section from the book, which is what happened when I went cycling. Haven't you got any cycling shorts? I was dressed in sensible trousers and a sleeveless t-shirt, with a cardigan tied around my waist in case it got cold. I thought my cycling attire was stylish and entirely suitable. Standing on the CEO's doorstep at 10 to 7 on that Sunday morning, I felt irritation rise. Funnily enough, I thought, no, I don't have any cycling shorts because I hadn't planned to go cycling on my day off. I wasn't at my best that morning. I downed half a bottle of wine when I got back from the ball and I was nursing a hangover. He's the CEO, don't be rude, I thought. No, I'm afraid I haven't, I said meekly. I've got a spare pair, he said, disappearing into the back of the house. He came back, carrying a small square of black fabric. Try those, you'll need them. The man had the legs of a greyhound and the torso of an underfed whippet. He handed me the small cycling shorts, the sort of thing you'd wear to the gym, only shorter and tighter, with a padded bum. I popped into the bathroom and did my best to squeeze into them. It looked like I'd stuffed a nappy down a pair of pants already a couple of sizes too small. And suddenly, my cycling attire wasn't quite so stylish. They're a bit tight, I shouted. I'd lost weight since I arrived in Australia, but I was still more of a Labrador than a Chihuahua. They're meant to be snug, don't worry, they'll stretch. I came out of the bathroom and he squinted at me. They'll do. We'll just go and pick up David, he lives up the road. Outside, he introduced me to a bicycle with 21 gears and gallantly made sure the saddle was the right height. Then he leapt onto his expensive-looking machine and pedalled off, as sprightly as a man 20 years younger. I did my best to keep up. As I struggled up the first rise, I contemplated the name of the town I was staying in. Broken Hill. Not broken flat or broken level. Broken Hill. It hadn't occurred to me before, I suppose because I was in a car. Now I was on a bicycle, watching the CEO's tight little arse disappear into the distance up a bloody great big hill. It took a long time to catch up, but he waited. Having trouble with the gears? I didn't answer, partly because I didn't trust myself to and partly because I couldn't breathe. Was he taking the piss? I was suddenly afraid he might be. I wondered if this was a regular thing. How many other gullible females had worn these shorts, I wondered. By the time we got to David's house, I was feeling sick. David took one look at me and shook his head. You can't wear that top, he said. He's right, I should have given you a different top. David was head of the University Department of Rural Health, and they were clearly mates, two of a kind, sun-tanned, lean sportsmen, not an ounce of fat between them. I wondered if they were in on the joke together. If you fall off, you'll scrape the skin on your arms wearing that, said David. Why would I fall off? I had no intention of falling off, but there was no point protesting. I felt outnumbered, so I waited as David rummaged around indoors, then he reappeared and triumphantly handed me a triple extra large lycra cycling top, the sort they wear on the Tour de France. It was a lurid mix of orange and blue, Broken Hill Mountain Bike Club plastered across it. Mountains. No one said anything about mountains. Here, try that on, he said. It was far too early on a Sunday morning to be anything other than compliant, so I ducked into yet another stranger's bathroom, dragged the baggy top over the too-tight nappy and waddled back outside. That'll do. Let's go and pick up the students. They live on the other side of town. Students? No one said anything about students either. By the time we got to where the students lived, and what a surprise, they were all wearing trendy cargo pants and skimpy tops. You wouldn't catch them wearing nappies and lycra. I had peaked. My legs were shaking, my heart was racing, my stomach was churning, and I badly needed to vomit or empty my bowels. You go ahead, I said. I'll catch up. I locked myself into a student toilet and dropped my head between my knees, trying not to be sick. I didn't want to go cycling. I had a hangover. I wanted to lie down on the side of the road in the scorching desert and let a massive eagle chew my head off. Anything rather than go cycling. Well, I did go cycling. And to my surprise, I enjoyed it. And even more to my surprise, I enjoyed Clyde's company. And I say to my surprise because I had discovered over coffee afterwards that we had absolutely nothing in common. He's a carnivore, I'm a vegetarian. He's liberal, I'm left-wing. He is mad about sport, I'm mad about theatre. He's teetotal, and I do like a glass of red wine. But that gave me a certain freedom to just relax and enjoy his company, which is something I had never ever done before. I had always been nervous and anxious and thinking, is this it? Is this the one? Is this the man for me? So I never relaxed enough to enjoy somebody's company and to allow them to see who I was as well. So we went out for dinner a few times, and I kept being surprised by how much I was enjoying this, but it wasn't love, surely, because he wasn't Mr. Right, he wasn't Mr. Perfect. Anyway, as time went on, it was clear that we were getting on very well. So well, in fact, that I realised that if we were going to have any hope of this relationship working, then one of us was going to have to move, because I was living in Sydney and he was living in Broken Hill. Now, given the fact that he was the CEO of the southeastern section and the head office was in Broken Hill, it was a bit of a no-brainer. I mean, it was going to be me moving. So I moved to Broken Hill. Now, being there for a weekend was one thing, and it was great fun for a weekend. Living there was an entirely different prospect. Now, whenever I see this slide now, I think to myself, that is so beautiful. When I first took that picture, I thought, what am I doing here? What is there here? I mean, this was taken literally about 5 minutes away from our house, just on the edge of the desert. But Broken Hill surprised me, because Broken Hill asked me to look beyond my first impressions. Within weeks of arriving, there was a plague of crickets that was so extreme that I used to cycle in Broken Hill, having got the taste of it, and I remember cycling to the post office one day, and it was like cycling through a puddle of water, because there were so many crickets splashing up on either side of the bicycle. It was like cycling through a puddle, and that was throughout town. People were sweeping them out of shops before they opened up in the morning. So crickets arrived, spiders, snakes, you name it. But the other thing that happened was that the drought broke. And then Broken Hill turned into that. This most extraordinarily beautiful display of wildflowers just appeared, popped up all over the place on the outskirts of town. The other thing that surprised me about Broken Hill was that I could actually grow vegetables there. In fact, I grew more vegetables in Broken Hill than I'd ever grown anywhere else, and I've lived in probably about 35 different houses, and I've always tried to grow something. But Broken Hill, I grew everything. You name it, I grew it in Broken Hill. And the most fantastic stone fruit there's no fruit fly in Broken Hill, so you can grow anything you like. And the other thing I did in Broken Hill, which was a lifelong ambition, was I kept chooks. And I have always wanted to do that, and I did it in Broken Hill. So lots of things surprised me about Broken Hill. I think the favourite thing for me was creek beds. Being able to, within 5 minutes of being in a town centre, be in just a pristine wilderness, where you could get a group of people, and what we would sometimes do is we'd go out with camping chairs, and we'd just dig a hole in the sand and pick up fallen branches, build a fire, and we might take out a play script and read it out loud around the fire, or we might just take out a frying pan and some eggs and just sit there and watch the moon come up and watch the stars come out, and it was absolutely beautiful. The other thing that I learned in Broken Hill was the value of community, which I suppose because I've moved around such a lot, I'd never really appreciated before. And what brought it home to me in Broken Hill was pudding production. The Broken Hill Women's Auxiliary exists to raise funds for the RFTS. A lot of the women live on station properties outside of town, so the RFTS is their lifeline. They hold a ball every year, and they also cook puddings every year, Christmas puddings. They cook 2,000 of them, and they are all made by hand. These puddings are, they're boiled for 3 hours in a traditional copper before they're hung up to dry. And as I say, all of the mixing is done by hand, the weighing, the pleating, the whole process. And the core of this group is 25 women who are in their 60s, 70s and 80s. And I couldn't quite understand, because this is an epic production. It takes 7 full days spread over 2 weeks. They start at 7:30 in the morning, they go right the way through till about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's just the actual production, never mind all the planning for it. And I found myself thinking, why would you do that? That sounds like such a lot of work. There must be easier ways to raise money. This is Jenny Trelaw, who is one of the ladies who's been involved with the Broken Hill Women's Auxiliary for many, many years. And Clyde knew Jenny very well, and I got talking to Jenny, and I agreed to go along and help out when I heard about pudding production. But as I say, I agreed to it with a certain amount of trepidation, because I couldn't quite understand why you would go to so much effort and trouble to make puddings. So I'm going to read another section from the book to you. Let me just check the time, make sure I'm not running out. Oh no, we're fine. And this is a section from a chapter all about pudding production. Steam rose from the bank of boiling coppers like a dragon exhaling its breath. June lifted the lid, checked the water levels, and then stirred the puddings bobbing in the copper. Her outline was swallowed by steam. Was it just me, or would the thought of standing in front of a bank of boiling coppers all day, without air conditioning, make most people check their diaries and find they were otherwise engaged? It was 35 degrees outside, at least 45 inside, and I couldn't see anything in that steaming, sweaty kitchen. I certainly couldn't see the point of spending the best part of 2 weeks making 2,000 Christmas puddings when there had to be quicker and much easier ways of raising money. I would normally be the first heading for the door, but I didn't want to lose face in front of the Broken Hill Women's Auxiliary, so I stayed put. Words like resilience and fortitude didn't even come close. Preparations had begun months before with label making, calico tearing. Cutting the fabric didn't give the same effect. Wire snipping, almond chopping. You know that sprinkle of spice that goes into a Christmas pudding? They needed 4 kilos of nutmeg alone. The same again of mixed spice. 60 litres of brandy. 740 kilos of dried fruit. The list went on and on. There were order forms to prepare, rosters of volunteers to organise, postage and packing to think about. Pudding production was undoubtedly the crowning glory of the Broken Hill Women's Auxiliary fundraising efforts for the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and it was an awe-inspiring achievement. 2,000 calico-wrapped puddings produced by hand in less than 2 weeks. But why? Why would such a group of sensible, mature-aged women put themselves through such labour-intensive, sweat-inducing, back-breaking work year in, year out? There had to be easier ways of raising money, surely. The demonstration of support for the RFTS through a sacrificial process of such epic proportions absolutely mystified me. Well, I stayed for the whole week, went back every day. On the sweaty 7th day of pudding production, I was on autopilot, pleating, prodding, cleaning and wiping. Jenny was sitting opposite, chatting with remarkable equanimity about the last major flood that had swamped her remote property. We lost a horse, a cow, all the chooks and ducks, and most of the sheep. How many was that, I asked. About 3,000? Didn't you have any warning? Jenny laughed and shook her head. It got noisy all of a sudden. Turns out the normally sluggish creek that ran past their house was suddenly inundated by floodwater 10 feet high that arrived without warning and roared through the property, destroying the sheep, the house, most of the outbuildings, and all of the garden, including the treasured rose bushes. We eventually found the shearers' quarters 16 kilometres downstream, she said. They were 40 feet up the side of the hill. I listened with growing incredulity to the litany of disasters she'd witnessed. The time a gas light blew up in a local Girl Guide camp. The time her son, Greg, knocked his teeth out and tore his nose off falling from his bike. And the day her husband, Keith, speared his arm on the branch of a mulga tree. Each time, the flying doctor was called. Jenny and her husband, Keith, hosted a flying doctor clinic on their property once a month, in a purpose-built building that attracted patients from kilometres around. It was the least we could do after all the flying doctor's done for us, said Jenny. Everywhere I turned, it was the same story. When a lad mustering sheep came off his motorbike and broke his back, the flying doctor landed on a dirt strip, stabilised his injuries and flew him to the nearest major hospital. When a child needing regular chemotherapy couldn't get to hospital, the flying doctor stepped in. When a stockman was bitten by a king brown, when a first-time mum went into premature labour or a girl got poked in the eye with a stick, when skin cancers, heart attacks, strokes, broken bones, dog bites, spider bites, and car crashes happened in a remote area, the story was always the same. The hardship these women had endured was something far beyond anything I had ever experienced. As the final day drew to a close, I realised with quiet shame that I had missed the point. Yes, of course there were easier ways of raising money and faster ways of making Christmas puddings. But there was a reverence in what we were doing, a sense of grace in the endlessly repetitive tasks, and the challenge of facing another grueling day and another 8 hours of nurturing those blobs of unremarkable ingredients until they were transformed into something magical. Each pudding was given such close attention at every stage of production that some of that attention rubbed off. Each plump, cosseted, calico-wrapped parcel became a silent offering of thanks, a grateful acknowledgement of all that the Flying Doctor had done to help desperate families no one else could reach. The last pudding was lifted out of the copper at 2:45 in the afternoon, to be squeezed and drained, dried and wiped, patted and pulled into shape. The wire was checked, the calico cleaned, the pleats smoothed, the ears tugged, the tag attached, the tie twisted, the hook threaded, and the final pudding was hung on the rack to dry at 3:10. Seeing all those fat calico bundles, each a creamy white with pert rabbit ears protruding from tightly closed wire necks, I felt a sense of pride that I'd had a very small part to play in that huge production. So, pudding production definitely brought home to me not just the sense of community, but the strength of love that lies behind why these women do what they do year in and year out. And some of them have been doing it for over 40 years, every year making all these Christmas puddings. And that sense of community ran through everything in Broken Hill. I don't think I've ever lived anywhere where I was able to, for example, if there's a cinema in Broken Hill, John runs it, another really interesting character, and you could call John and say, what time does the film start this afternoon, John, on a Sunday? And he'd say, oh, it's starting at 3. Is that all right? I can make it later if you'd like. This is a town of 20,000 people. So you quickly got to know people's names. So it was Phil in the paper shop, it was John in the cinema, it was Kathy in the art gallery. And I did more in Broken Hill than I think I've ever done anywhere. I took jewellery making classes. I went to a pottery workshop. And the thing I did that I was most pleased about was that I finally sat down and did the writing that I'd been telling myself I wanted to do for many years, and had always found an excuse not to and a reason not to. And I thought, no, Broken Hill is where I'm going to do it. And so, and I have to say, thanks to Clyde's support, and again, he is a man who, there's not a romantic bone in his body, and that's probably why I love him. Because in the past I had, again, always looked at the surface of things and thought it was the trappings of romance that mattered, the flowers and the chocolates and the sweet words and the poetry. Well, that just goes straight over the top of Clyde's head. But what he is, he's incredibly supportive and incredibly loyal. And he was beside me all the way, saying, if you think you can write, get on and do it. And I will support you, and I will be there for you. And when I sent out my first manuscript, which wasn't this book, by the way, it was a completely different book, and it got knocked back, and I'd go, oh, nobody wants to publish me. Clive would be there saying, listen, you know you can write something the market wants to read. Okay. I think he may slightly have regretted that, because I ended up sending a manuscript of a book I self-published to a publisher here in Australia, and they read it and said, yeah, really like it, come and have a meeting. And they decided in the end not to publish that particular book, but they said, when we'd talked a little bit, they said, oh, well, you've had quite an interesting life. What about your story? Would you be willing to write that down? So I said, well, possibly. Obviously, I'll have to check with Clyde because it would involve him. And to his credit, he said, "Is what you want to do? Go ahead and do it." So obviously, I made sure he was happy with the manuscript before it went to the publisher. But that's why I wrote this book. And in writing it, I think I was surprised at how much I learned in Broken Hill. And what I really like is that in Broken Hill I learned to look below the surface of things, which, given that it's a mining town, is really quite appropriate. Because in Broken Hill I think there are, from memory, 3 sets of traffic lights. That's it. Town, 20,000 people, 3 sets of traffic lights. But that's above ground. Underground, there are something like 132. And it all happens underground. And very often we look at the surface of things, and I was as guilty of that as anybody, and forget to look below the surface. And in Broken Hill I learned to look below the surface. And I suppose the other thing was that I used to be addicted to fairy tales and romance, and we had an actual princess came to Broken Hill, Princess Mary of Denmark. She came to launch a new breast care service for the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and we were on the same table as her for lunch, and I was an absolute lather of nervousness, and she was delightful and gracious and beautiful, and made everybody feel at ease, And at the end of it, I couldn't wait to get my gardening shoes back on again, and I realised that I don't belong in a princess world. I belong with this man. We no longer live in Broken Hill, sadly, but that's because they moved the head office of the South Eastern section from Broken Hill to Sydney in advance of Clyde retiring, because knowing that he was retiring, the board decided that they would probably stand a better chance of finding a replacement, given that the service is so much more complex now than it was when Clyde joined. If the head office were in Sydney and they could recruit into Sydney. So that's disappointing, and we go back as often as we can, and every time we go back we look at the property pages. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we ended up back there. So that's Love in the Outback, just a little sort of flavour of the book. And I'm very happy to take any questions, if anybody has any questions. Thank you very much.
Where do you buy the goodies?
Oh, yes, the goodies. From Olwyn Reynolds, and you might still be able to get an order. I seem to have created more orders for them, so of course I feel terribly guilty about that. Exactly, yes. In fact, Olwyn had a call from an Australian comedian, Bob Downs.
Yes.
Yeah, saying, "I've read the book, I need a pudding." So yes, if you come up and see me afterwards, I'll give you Olwyn's details. And you
They
can...
closed in the next week, but it was close to being full.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Right. Yes, because their cut-off is absolutely 2,000. I know last year they did about 2,100 and something, because I helped them last year as well, but this year they've said, no, we're all getting older, we're going to do 2,000 and that's it. You obviously know about puddings.
Someone's a Jimaroo,
Right.
and sent me an email and just said, look after our community.
Fantastic. Yes, because they post them out. In fact, they post them out all over the world.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you miss most about Broken Hill now that you're back in Sydney?
3 things: the space, the silence, and the community. Yeah. The magic of being able to walk into the desert and to be able to hear, so far away that you can't see it, the sound of a kangaroo's tail hitting the ground as it hops. And it's out there somewhere, but you can't see it. That was beautiful, yes. Yeah.
And is your dingo coping with life in Sydney?
You've obviously read the book.
I've read the book.
She's finding it challenging, yes. Because what I used to be able to do is I could just take her out of the desert and it would just be me and her. And now, just to explain for everybody, we adopted a dog, and it turned out to be a dingo. And in Sydney, she has to contend with other dogs, which is nerve-wracking for her. She actually doesn't know how. She was never socialised. She was, I think, probably 11, 12 when we got her, and she'd always been an outdoor dog where she'd been living before. Her owner hadn't socialised her with other dogs, and so she sees another dog and she thinks, whoa. She gets nervous and then her hackles go up. So much as I've tried to socialise her with labradoodles outside the local cafe, it's not working. I think she just thinks sheep when she sees them. Yes.
Have you been home to England?
I have, and my family have been out to
I was
Broken
going to
Hill
ask
as
that
well.
question.
Yes, yeah. 2 of my sisters came out with their husbands, and 2 of my nieces have also been out. So it was just joyful to be able to show them Broken Hill, to take them down the old silver mine, to take them out to a creek-led barbecue and a camp out. So yeah, they had the best time. They thought Broken Hill was more enjoyable than Sydney. With all of the attractions that Sydney has to offer, they said the highlight was Broken Hill. Yeah.
Are you still involved in any way with the Royal Flying Doctor Service?
Only in as much as I'm a constitutional member. So I'll be going to the AGM. When I'm back in Broken Hill, I get back in touch with the auxiliary, and if it weren't for a hospital operation, then I'd be going back up there to go and help with puddings this year. And Clyde is also, he's on the board of the African Flying Doctor Service. So we're going out to Kenya next month, and he's a trustee of the UK Friends of the RFDS. So from there we're going on to the UK because there's a big fundraising event there for them as well. Yeah.
Is it hard to get people in England to understand?
Yes. I don't quite know how you do it without experiencing it. I mean, writing about it is my attempt to, but for somebody from England to understand the vast space in Broken Hill and around that area is nigh on impossible. I mean, talking to somebody at the Broken Hill Women's Auxiliary Board, he was telling me how big his station was, and I worked out that was the size of Devon and Cornwall combined. I mean, that's like 2 counties of England with hundreds of thousands of people living in them, and that's one family on one property. Yeah, so it's very hard to try and convey that.
Really, it's the tyranny of distance that is the significant thing for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. To try and win friends in England for the Royal Flying Doctor Service when they don't understand what it's like.
Yes.
It's been really difficult.
Yeah. But interestingly, Prince Charles is the patron of the Friends of the RFDS, and of course he's been to Australia several times, so he understands a bit about Australia, and in fact I met him in Longreach a couple of years ago when he came out with the Duchess of Cornwall, and so he is somebody who understands a bit about outback Australia.
He went to high school in Australia.
He did, yeah, he went to Treetops, was it?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. I think to Timtops, that was it. I knew there was a tut-tie there. Yes, yeah. And also some of the trustees on that board in the UK, they include Lord Glendenbrook, who personally put £600,000 into refurbishing the base in Broken Hill, the medical centre, and that's because his father was in the First World War and got wounded in the trenches, and it was a long time until medical assistance reached him, so he knows what it feels like to be a long way away from medical assistance through his father. So there are those connections, and there is a lot of toing and froing between England and Australia. There are quite strong connections between the two countries, and I think that helps as well.
Do you think you're writing more books?
You go first.
Do you think you're writing any more books?
I've got another one coming out next May, which is a book of stories from families who live on the land. So not necessarily farming, graziers, pastoralists from around Australia. So I've done the first draft of that one, and that's with the publisher for the editing now. So that's the next one, and then beyond that I've got an idea for a children's book. So yes, I will. Yeah, I hope.
Okay, I guess I should confess, my dad was a miner. I was born in Kalgoorlie. I lived in a few bush towns as a kid. And I must say you captured that feeling of community beautifully. But the
Thank
question I have for you is, Broken Hill's a big city. I've driven through it a few times, I've stayed there once or twice, and I just feel like this is not a mining town, this is a vast city.
It's very spread out.
Yes, it is,
Yes.
that's right.
Yeah.
But what I'm wondering is, A, have you ever lived in one of those more, typical mining towns, maybe a few hundred people and all the guys work in the mine and all the wives do the babysitting?
Yeah.
And is the chemistry different, or you were getting, it sounds like, honestly, it would bring your tears to my eyes, a lot of you, because I was remembering my childhood. I'm just a little bit puzzled that that chemistry can exist in, quotes, a big city. And I wonder if you've ever lived in a little town, which could, the chemistry be even worse.
I've never lived in a little mining town, no.
Oh.
I've lived in a little village in England, but never a mining town in Australia. And I think part of the reason why I was able to plug into that chemistry in Broken Hill, I have to credit Clyde for that, because he'd lived there for 40 years. And being so connected with the Royal Flying Doctor Service, then a lot of people in the community know Clyde, and through that I got to know a lot of people in the community as well. But having said that, I also know people who have moved to Broken Hill not knowing anybody, and they have equally felt welcomed. I mean, something like the art gallery, the regional art gallery in Broken Hill, whenever they have a new exhibition opening, the entire town is invited to come along. There's a drink, there's a nibble, and in you go, and probably only maybe a couple of hundred people might turn up, but it's just the principle of saying, no charge, everybody's invited, come along. And I suppose there is that sense of, because it's remote, you do band together. You feel like you're in it together. It's almost like it's an island, but it's not surrounded by water, it's surrounded by desert.
It's more like country than city.
Oh yes, yeah.
I'll stick my notes in here. I was talking to Deb about it, before the event. I don't know if anyone who has lived in Broken Hill, but I've had a few summers out there, and it's exactly as Deb describes it. I went to the art gallery for an opening and had the nibbles and walked around. I went to the mineral exhibit.
Yeah.
And went to the main street. It is an amazing place. There is a strong sense of community, and I grew up myself in a small country town.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Broken Hill does have 25,000 people.
Well, actually, it's now only got about 19,000. The population has dropped.
It does have that exact same feel, ambience.
Yeah.
Did I hear, I'm not sure, but I think I might have heard once that the RFDS exists mostly on donations. Is it?
It's about 30% donations, about 40% government contracts, so that's things like working on behalf of the ambulance service and providing the inter-hospital transfers. That's running clinics for oil and gas stations, and 30% government funded. So I think they have to raise around about 25 million a year from the general public, just to keep going. It's a huge amount. I mean, something like, they've got a fleet of aircraft, over 50 aircraft now, and just something like overhauling one engine costs $250,000 because they have to maintain the fleet to the same standards as a commercial airline. And yet they're flying planes onto dirt strips, which one stone can cut through a tyre, and then you have to replace the tyre, and the tyre might cost $800. So it's a very expensive business, getting medical care to people who are in a remote area. But you will never hear them complain, because they're so grateful to have it.
Attract doctors? I know it's difficult to get doctors out in the country, is it? Or is there some sort of different feeling about the RFDS, that it's more of an adventure and it's something exciting that doctors would want to do?
There is that to it, certainly, because you do get an opportunity to do emergency work, obviously, as well as the primary healthcare work. But they still have to recruit from overseas. There still are not enough Australian doctors who are willing to work in a remote area.
It says.
Yeah, so they recruit from Germany, from England. They've got a Scottish doctor at the moment. Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, Deb's going to be around for another 15 minutes.
And I
If you'd
have
like
got
to come
copies
up
of the
and-
book, if anybody wants to buy one.
But for now, let's just all give her a really big hand of applause.